Welcome to Awake Us Now with Pastor Chris Dodge. Our program is sponsored by Awake Us Now. We have a heart to see awakening in America. Revelation is a study many of you have been asking for, so here's Pastor with today's teaching on Revelation.
This is the first session of a new Bible study of the book of Revelation, the revelation of Jesus the Messiah. I'm Pastor Chris Dodge, teaching pastor at Awake Us Now, and on behalf of all of us at Awake, I'd like to welcome you this morning. I pray that this will be a time of great blessing, encouragement, amazement for each and every one of us as we take a look at this powerful book in the coming days. There are just a couple of things that I'd like to bring to your attention before we get started with our study this morning. First of all, welcome to those of you who are with us today. If you've been with us before, it's great having you back. If you are new, it is so good to have you with us. Several things. First of all, this is such an important class, and it speaks to so many people that it's really important to put it in nice bite-sized chunks. This is a complicated book. Let's just be very honest. And it is so good to be able to take a look at it in very small segments and apply those directly to our lives. I believe this is going to be quite worthwhile. First question that we ought to deal with today is, why now? Why are we studying the book of Revelation right now? Now, for some, I think the question is the answer at least is an obvious one. These are unusual days. And let's be frank, many people who have really no connection with Christianity and no real great interest in the Bible are suddenly speaking out publicly and saying, are these the last times? Is this what the book of Revelation is talking about? And because there is such a great interest, it seems natural to study the book of Revelation right now. But I'd like to suggest that there are far more compelling reasons to study the book of Revelation right now. 3 in particular. And these compelling reasons are the result of prophetic words given by Jesus himself 2,000 years ago. In the midst of national upset, in the midst of all sorts of confusion and chaos and concern around the world, many people are focusing on the immediate. And as a result, many times people are missing the forest for the trees. You see, Jesus predicted some things that would happen as the end of time drew near. They are very clear. They are remarkable. And quite honestly, I believe you can make a very strong argument that those 3 things that Jesus spoke of have been fulfilled in the lifetime of many of us. So here they are. First of all, the return of Israel. You know, the nation of Israel is a very unique nation. It is the only nation in the history of the planet that was destroyed and its people scattered for nearly 2,000 years and then came back. It is one of the most remarkable occurrences in the history of the planet. And it is something that Jesus himself predicted almost 2,000 years ago. This is what we read in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, verse 24. Jesus was on the Mount of Olives on the eastern side of the city of Jerusalem, looking across the Kidron Valley toward the great temple and the beautiful walls of Jerusalem. And Jesus predicted this would happen. He said that the inhabitants of Judea and Jerusalem, the Jewish people, he said they will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Jesus spoke those words just days before his crucifixion and resurrection. And years after he spoke them, they became a reality in a remarkable way. We know from great historians of the past that in the year 70 A.D., the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman legions. The Jewish people were scattered throughout the nations. According to an eyewitness account of the Jewish historian Josephus, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million Jewish people died in the siege of Jerusalem. About 100,000 of them were sold into slavery. And in a fulfillment of words that had been spoken by Moses 3,500 years ago, they were carried down to Egypt in ships. They flooded the slave market and no one would buy them. And that's exactly what took place. And in the centuries that followed, everything that Jesus said took place. The Jewish people were scattered. Jerusalem was trodden down by the Gentiles. Gentile is a biblical word for non-Jewish people. First it was the Romans. Then it was the Persians. Then it was the Islamic invasion. Then it was the Crusaders. Then it was the Ottoman Turks. Then, after World War I, it was the British Mandate. And then, in 1967, for the first time in almost exactly 2,000 years, Jewish people once again controlled the city of Jerusalem, and it was no longer trodden down by the Gentiles. That is not some interpretation. That is simply fact. And it's exactly what Jesus predicted. Please note, he said Jerusalem would be trampled down by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. In other words, we are now getting to the final events of world history, according to Jesus. There's a second thing that Jesus predicted, and that is gospel to the nations. Jesus told his disciples while he was on the Mount of Olives in those last days before his crucifixion and resurrection, that this gospel of the kingdom would be proclaimed throughout all the nations, and then the end would come. In fact, here's what we read in Matthew 24, verse 14. Jesus said, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." Now, when Jesus spoke those words, he spoke them to his closest followers, the 12 apostles. It seemed like an impossible task to them, I am sure. Early believers traveled throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East, spreading the message of Christ. Later generations of believers spread out through the nations. And in our day, we have seen something remarkable happen with the explosion of technology. Do you realize, I look at the videos that we have produced at Awake, and they are watched by people all over the world. We hear from people on every continent, except I don't believe we've heard from anyone in Antarctica yet, but all over the world. And the message of Christ is spreading in ways that people 2,000 years ago could not have dreamed of. I still remember a few years ago receiving word from some believers in Africa who lived in remote regions, thatched huts, but they had iPhones, and they shared how they are spreading the message of Jesus to the neighboring villages. But it's a reminder of what's happening in our day. The message is spreading all over the world, and Jesus says it will go through the entire world to all the nations, and then the end will come. Do you realize how close we must be? There's a third thing, and that too is something that Jesus spoke of, and that is deception of Christendom. Let me elaborate on that word Christendom. For hundreds and hundreds of years, Christianity was pretty much confined to what we call Europe. After the Islamic conquest of North Africa and the Middle East, Christianity was basically found in what we today call Europe, and it was there for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was only after the age of discovery that Christianity branched out a little bit more and moved to the Americas, especially to the North American continent. But things have changed dramatically, and it's both good and bad. Jesus talked about the dangers of deception. This is what he said, Mark 13, verses 5 and 6. Jesus said to them, to the apostles, to the disciples, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am he,' and will deceive many." Jesus said deception is one of the great signs of the last days. And what we have seen is a deception on a huge scale, and yet at the same time, the spread of the gospel around the world. I'm reminded of the words of Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Christendom has changed dramatically. Christianity is no longer confined to Europe. In fact, Europe and North America, many Christian churches are emptying. Many believers have fallen away. And yet the gospel has spread dramatically just in our lifetimes. Let me give you some illustrations, if I may. First of all, in the year 1800, about 1% of Protestant Christians lived outside of Europe and North America. Almost all Protestant Christians were found in Europe and in North America. By the year 1900, 100 years later, about 10% of Protestant Christians lived outside of Europe and North America. And that was because during the 1800s, there was a massive push to evangelize the world. Devout believers traveled all over the globe sharing the message of Jesus. Those who couldn't travel supported with their prayers and their finances. And the message spread. And so within 100 years, 10% of Protestant Christians were living outside of Europe and North America. By the year 2000, 100 years after that, 67% of Protestant Christians were living outside of Europe and North America. But it's even more dramatic than that. We have seen a global shift. What was historic Christendom has become secularized and, frankly, has worshipped idols of their own making. We've worshipped ourselves, we've worshipped success, we've worshipped education, the list goes on and on. But the message of Jesus is spreading in the rest of the world in remarkable ways. One of the most dramatic examples of that is on the African continent. In 1900, 9% of Africans were Christian, about 10 million people. In the year 2005, the latest statistics that I have, 46% of Africans were Christian. Over 400 million believers in Jesus the Messiah. And what is especially noteworthy is that most of that has happened in the last few decades. And it hasn't stopped, folks. The message is spreading throughout the African continent, and it's not just in Africa. It's in Central and South America. It is in Asia, Southeast Asia. It is in what used to be the most difficult region in all of the planet to reach. For 700 years, the Islamic world was incredibly resistant to the message of Jesus. And now, Muslim people are coming to faith in Christ in a way that we have not seen in 7+ centuries. Dramatic things are happening. And Jesus said, when these things begin to take place, look up, because your redemption draws near. These are remarkable occurrences, and they are things that ought to cause us to take note. One other item, in 1980, among believers in Jesus of all denominations, there were 2 white Christians for every 1 non-white Christian. That was 1980. That's not that long ago. By the year 2000, there were 4 non-white Christians for every 1 white Christian. In other words, the message of Jesus is spreading across the planet like wildfire. We have never seen anything like this since the birth of the Jesus movement at Pentecost, almost 2,000 years ago. It is obvious that history is ramping up and winding down. And we are getting closer and closer to what Jesus predicted almost 2,000 years ago. I believe that's why we ought to look at the book of Revelation. I'm not trying to be overly dramatic here or a fearmonger. To the contrary, this is exciting. But it's also something we need to take note of. Because quite honestly, many people are totally unaware of this truth. But when you see it, then you realize everything he said would happen is happening. And dear friends, it's happening in our lifetimes. That is incredibly significant. And if ever there were a time we ought to be taking a look at the book of Revelation, this is the time. I was talking to a pastor friend of mine, in fact, one of my colleagues at Awake, just a matter of weeks ago. And he mentioned the fact that as he takes a look at what's happening in the world and reads the news, he says, I feel like I'm reading the book of Revelation. And there's a great deal of truth to that observation. Therefore, why now? That's why. Because God is on the move. And he is keeping all of his promises. That ought to excite us. It's sobering, no doubt about it. It ought to cause us to be repentant and faithful people. It's something we need to take a look at. And so, that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at the book of Revelation. As we do that, we're going to be talking about how do you interpret this book? I'll be very honest with you. The history of the way followers of Jesus have interpreted the book of Revelation is confusing, to say the least. I still remember, it's over 40 years ago, I was a student at the seminary, finishing up my seminary education. And I had taken a class with one of my favorite professors. He was both a brilliant scholar, very, very eloquent, and yet very down to earth. It was one of my favorites. Anyway, it was a class on the book of Revelation. I thoroughly enjoyed the class. And as part of the class, one of the things we were required to do was to write a major research paper. And so I chose to write a research paper on the mark of the beast from the book of Revelation, chapter 13, about how to interpret the number 666. It was a fascinating study for me, but it was also a bit troubling because, you see, I had been brought up with one particular interpretation of the last days and of the book of Revelation. But as I studied that number and the way believers throughout the ages have interpreted it, as I took a look at the original language and took a look at the Hebrew equivalents as well, I found myself thinking, I can make a strong defense for a whole lot of different interpretations of this. And in the years that have followed, not just the years, the decades that have followed, that conviction has become stronger and stronger. I am well aware of the fact that among followers of Jesus, there are many pet theories about the book of Revelation and about the last days. I recognize that many people hold to those very strongly, but I would encourage each of us to approach this book with humility. Humility before God, humility before His Word, and humility before one another. Over the centuries, there have been several major views on how to interpret the book of Revelation. They have been popular at particular times in history. They reemerge at other times in history. And it's very worthwhile to take a look at those views. Very quickly, I'd like to share the four views with you here this morning, okay? The first view is what's known as the preterist view, or preterist, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And it's the view that simply says, basically about everything in the book of Revelation, with the possible exception of the discussion of the very end of the world, everything in the book of Revelation took place during the lives of first century believers. The preterist view maintains that the book of Revelation was basically fulfilled during the lifetime of those who had ministered with Jesus, known Him, heard Him, seen Him, and shared with others the mighty things that He had done, but also that He has risen from the grave. The preterist view maintains that by the latter part of the first century, either by the 70s or the 90s, this book was fulfilled, and the prophetic words that John had written had already come to pass. That is a view that is widely held today. It has become more and more popular in recent years, and it is held by some very devout and dedicated followers of Jesus. The second view is what is known as the historicist view. This view maintains that the book of Revelation basically lays out the history of God's people from the resurrection of Jesus until his return. The historicist view maintains that what we have here is a snapshot of what is going to happen and what has happened throughout the centuries. This particular view was very popular among Protestant believers, especially over the last few hundreds of years. It is a view that has fallen on rough times in our day, and yet there is still a lot to commend it. The third view is the view known as the futurist view. And this is the one that is perhaps most popular among followers of Jesus in our day. And that is the view that the book of Revelation tells us about events that are yet to occur. The futurist view usually maintains that from about chapter 5 onward, everything is talking about future events, what's going to happen as the return of Jesus draws near. This view is the view of many popular books on the last days, and it's a view that has been accepted by many people both in North America and Central and South America, but also around the world. And finally, there is the view known as the idealist view or the symbolic view, a variety of terms, and it maintains that the book of Revelation just basically presents timeless truths and principles that occur throughout history until the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, I want to stress that there are devout, dedicated, committed Christian people who hold to each and every one of those views. But by and large, those who hold to the views maintain theirs is the correct one. It's human nature, isn't it? But what if? What if? Because this is at the heart of what if. God is brilliant. I do not say that to be facetious. Our God is brilliant. He is not only the creator of the universe, he is the greatest mind of the universe. And his scriptures are dramatic and powerful. No matter how many times you read the Bible, you continue to see more. And you realize how magnificent, how amazing, how God is so deliberate in everything he does. He is brilliant. So what if? What if the God who gave this revelation through Jesus to his dear friend and disciple, John, what if God very intentionally arranged this book so that it would apply in every age and in every day? I'd like to suggest that there is validity to all of these. And as we study this book, we are not going to study it in the sense of saying, well, this is what I think, so everybody's got to accept that. Rather, we're going to look at what believers have said throughout the centuries. We're going to look at the clear text of Scripture. And we're going to allow that book to speak to each and every one of us. Because I'm convinced that's what God desires to do. And I will just tell you, he is brilliant. He is absolutely, positively brilliant. He makes no mistakes. He keeps his word. He fulfills what he has promised. He will return. And therefore, we want to listen to the words of this book, the revelation of Jesus the Messiah.
You've been listening to Awake Us Now with Pastor Chris Dodge. Our program is sponsored by Awake Us Now. Have questions about today's message? Text or call us at 612-545-5654 or email us at mail@awakeusnow.com. And join us again next time for Pastor's continued study of the book of Revelation.